Over my time on YouTube, I've noticed that many of my subscribers don't know about easy-to-use resources online for research. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to some of the most useful tools for research in 2021. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel, like the video if you haven't already, and leave a comment for the sake of the algorithm. Let's begin with Wikipedia. Is Wikipedia useful? Actually, it really is. I think that if I had Wikipedia when I was a child, I would be orders of magnitude more knowledgeable than I am today. The reason why is because of two particular facets of Wikipedia. One is Wikipedia's use of hyperlinks to reference other articles within the encyclopedia. And the second is actually the lack of rigor in developing Wikipedia pages, which allows for different opinions to be visible where they maybe normally wouldn't be. If any of you have visited a Wikipedia page, you'll notice that as you read through the page, some words, depending on the page's level of editing, some words will have hyperlinks that reference other Wikipedia page describing that subject, whatever the word is. This is something we didn't have when I grew up. I'm not to talk about the whole days, but we grew up with written encyclopedias. So some people would have like Encyclopedia Britannica in their house, several volumes. And it was well known that intelligent people in their early youth, like some famous academics, for example, John von Neumann, the founder of game theory, would memorize entire encyclopedias when they were kids. But that does not compare to what you can get on Wikipedia. The breadth of information on Wikipedia is far greater. But what's more important is that on every page in Wikipedia, every time you encounter something that you don't know, you have oftentimes the chance to read about it separately. And if you give yourself enough time and kindle your curiosity, this can lead you to sitting in front of a Wikipedia for 2-3 hours and surfing Wikipedia, which is what I used to spend a lot of my time doing, and I still do sometimes. It's really, really fun because it can take you to places of learning and learning about interesting things that you didn't know were interesting, but that you encounter as you go along. So that's the first reason Wikipedia is really useful. The second is that each of the pages is not very well, they're cited, they have to be cited for information to stay there, but basically what happens on many pages is a battleground between people with different opinions. So you'll often find strikingly different opinions or different kind of information than you would normally encounter on a Wikipedia page. It doesn't mean that you're supposed to take this information and rely on it, but rather you can use it as a sort of a way to scan the environment to see what could be occurring in a certain subject that you might not normally see. And afterwards, follow through on it with real research, which we'll discuss now. Before we discuss how to research properly online, we have to discuss the subject of academic journals. What's an academic journal? Most of us, when we grew up, thought that discourse, intelligent, sophisticated discourse, happens through books, through non-fiction books. And this is not uniformly true across the fields of academic disciplines. In fact, as the field gets more quantitative or more scientific, most of the discussion occurs through academic journals in what are called academic papers, and not actually in books. For example, you would be hard-pressed to know what's going on in the fields of computer science and biology right now by reading a recently published book, because it'll be outdated and it's not really the communication style that the actual academics use. So it's a way really for them usually to inform the public rather than communicate with each other. Moreover, for young people that are still developing their literary and analytical skills, reading academic papers is far superior than reading books. The level of sophistication, precision, and language used is superior. And if you are able to understand current academic papers in your field, you will be able to understand any book written in your field. Now, academic journals are the journals that publish the academic papers. Each journal is governed by a board of directors that is composed of academics. And there is a board of academics that accept individual papers that are submitted to the journal. The journals are not of equal caliber. And in fact, in each field, as you get to know the field a little bit better, you'll come to realize which journals are the most prestigious journals. Usually, academics will try to publish their paper in the most prestigious journals. So, for example, in biology, they'll aim to publish a paper in Nature or in Cell before they relinquish their efforts and publish in, for example, the Antioxidant Monthly or something like that. So what are academic papers anyway? Academic papers are the actual discourse between academics over the generations. The way they're designed is such that basically when an academic paper is accepted by an academic journal, the academic journal, the board of directors or the people who approve the paper, the academics, will review the details of the methods and experimental design and so on of the paper and only accept the paper for publication if they approve of it and believe that it correctly reflects the study. Therefore, when a paper is approved, In general, in academia, if you're publishing your own paper, if you cite an already published paper from an academic journal, you're thought to stand on solid ground. And in this way, a chain of logic and credibility develops over time between academic papers. Note, however, that though papers are accepted by academic journals, even though their experimental design and statistical analysis and so on are in detail reviewed by the academics, there are still mistakes made. And very many times, not only mistakes are made, but sometimes intentional falsehoods are portrayed by academics, for reasons that we'll discuss shortly. But before we do, let's discuss the kinds of academic papers. I'd like to divide them into two major groups. There are a group of papers called descriptive papers. These kind of papers do not publish new data in them. Rather, they usually review a subject somewhat comprehensively and sometimes come up with a new way of looking at the subject or a new theory or a new thought that can be testable in future publications. To be honest with you, that's what I often try to do with my own YouTube videos. I review papers and then try to come up with something unique or some interesting connections that are individual to me. In academia, this is not really respected. This is not considered value added, really. Although some top academics will publish review papers, they usually do so rarely because it does not develop either their reputation or their career. On the other hand, there are papers that are either experimental or observational that introduce new information. These papers still have a descriptive section. Their introduction and their discussion section will have somewhat of a literature review, but it'll be limited and they'll be focused on analyzing the results of their information. These are the papers that add to an academic's reputation and career progression. And these are the papers that academics shoot for. The more times a paper is cited, like this kind of paper, the more times the academic's reputation develops and his career progresses, his or her career progresses. If you guys don't know how an academic's career progresses, just try to color the picture. And this is changing a little bit now. Tenure is changing a little bit these days. But historically, academics would try to get a job in a university in what's called a tenure track position. So in general, in America, for example, an adjunct professor is with the title adjunct is not in the tenure track. They may be PhDs, but they were not accepted for the tenure track or something like that. Or they're often professionals that also teach. On the other hand, an associate professor and onwards is usually in a tenure track position. Tenure track means that when you first begin your position at the university, you get a salary and you don't have any kind of assurances that you're going to keep this job. But when you get tenure, historically, you would have the job for life. And so most academics were desperately seeking tenure. Once they received tenure, their behavior, their research and everything would change quite a bit. But before tenure, they have to be very aware of politics and their career progression. Now, when I was in school, I remember my professor telling me, I have tenure. The only way I could lose this is if I slept with a student in front of all of you on the table in front of the classroom. He actually said this in front of the classroom. Actually, in the last few years, there's a lot of professors who've had relationships with students or something like that lost their tenure. So tenure is no longer as much of an assurance, but nonetheless, that's what directs professors mainly in the early part of their career. In the later part, and for some of the ambitious people in the early part, their goal is to change their field. And to change their field, they have to get their ideas popular. And how do you get a paper to become popular in the first place? By publishing a contrarian or surprising outcome. That's how my graduate advisor actually talked to me about my own paper. She told me we would like to find something that is contrarian, that opposes our former expectations from the theory in our field. My field was called decision science. So we would look for something contrarian and then title the paper in such a way that it surprises people. Now, interestingly, for those of you watching YouTube, you'll also notice that a similar thing happens in the world of nutrition. The more contrarian you are, the more attention you get. So this is just something to keep in mind when you're reading papers. There are incentives behind the professor's reasons for publishing that paper, and you have to keep that always in mind when you're trying to find the actual truth. Now let's talk about paper authorship. What is first authorship? Well, first of all, the more people there are on a paper's publication authorship, the less each person benefits career-wise. In fact, let me tell you a story from my own life, a true story. When I was in graduate school, I worked as a research assistant for a professor who I became quite close to and cared a lot about. I also did my thesis with the same professor. My thesis was working on her own research, but basically I performed, myself and the other researcher that I hired for the team, we performed all of the research and all of the analysis, but under the guidance of two other professors, one from the London School of Economics and one from ESE in Spain, that's IESE. So we took their guidance, but we did all of the work. So I was offered, of course, to be the third author on the paper after the two professors. But because I cared a lot about the professor and I wanted to help her career, and because I knew I wasn't going to pursue a career in academia, I knew I was going to leave to try to work in industry. I decided to leave my name out of the paper because I knew it would help her. It was a very big paper. It was funded by the NHS in the UK, which is the National Healthcare of the UK. So I knew it would help her a lot, and I removed my name from it. So keep that in mind in general. If you see only two authors on a paper, there may be more authors. They may not be the people that did all of the analysis. And also, in general, having only two authors means quite a bit for their reputations and their career progression. That means this is their work. Now, a side note, by convention, if there are two authors, so for example, the two authors who published the most in my field were Kahneman and Tversky. If there are two authors, you will cite a paper by mentioning both of the authors' last names. So Kahneman and Tversky, Daniel Kahneman, and I forgot Tversky's first name. But you would write Kahneman and Tversky and then the date. If there are more than two authors, you write the first author's name and then et al. E-T-A-L. That's what it is. It's in Latin. So if you guys ever see me saying so-and-so et al., that means that's the first name of the authors followed by at least two others. Now, the first author on the paper is usually the person who really either initiated the research or really took control of most of the research. But sometimes there may be up to 10 names on a paper. And the reason why is because of academic politics. So say, for example, you're a young academic, associate professor, and you're working in some established professor's research lab, like David Sinclair's, for example, from the longevity field. David Sinclair is the final author on a bunch of papers. There's no way he's working on all of these papers. But what's happening is that he has influence over those academics. They work in his lab, so somehow maybe his lab's funding funds the research, something like that. So somehow you start to incorporate all of the people that you have to take account of in academia. So if you guys want to contact authors of a paper to try to understand more about it, you always want to start with the first authors and literally in a row. First, second, and third, those are the guys that are most involved. And usually the last author is the least involved in the paper. Now that we've reviewed what academic journals are and what academic papers are, let's talk about Google Scholar. Remember, we're going to be looking for academic papers when we research, but let's talk about Google Scholar. I am a huge fan of Google Scholar. I can't even imagine what my life would be like if Google Scholar existed when I first got into undergrad. When I was in undergrad, and even in grad school, I believe, so this is how it works. The issue with these academic journals is this. They can't make money selling their journals to the public. So what they do is they sell their journals to universities, or to organizations, or universities, libraries, but also to organizations that collect academic journals or academic papers from different sources and make them available to students and to universities and so on. So when I was in undergrad, we had to search through these different services. Like, for example, there was one called JSTOR. You'd have to go into the service. You'd have to check, first of all, is this journal covered by this individual service? If it is, then I'm going to go search in the service for the journal. The search function would be horrible. You would know a paper was in that service or in that journal and still be unable to find it or take a great deal of time finding it. And those are for papers that we knew existed. What if you were trying to learn about a subject and you don't even know which papers exist? It was prohibitively time consuming. The search functions were horrible. You wouldn't end up learning that much. You'd spend a great deal of time and not really get a really proper bird's eye view on a subject. You'd be finding random papers here and there instead of knowing exactly what's going on. This all changed with the advent of Google Scholar. Now you have the entire world at your fingertips, with every paper that you could possibly imagine that you can access very quickly. Here I'm going to tell you how to do that. So now let's discuss scholar.google.com. That's the website you want to go to. I'll give you some tips on how to use it to get the papers you want and how to use it to learn what you want. First of all, sign into your Google account before you access scholar.google.com. This will allow you to save papers into your library, which is very important. Now here's a guide on how to search for papers. First of all, you can search on scholar.google.com the same way you search on Google. It's a very powerful search engine and very effective. Now, when you search for something initially, say you want to know about insulin resistance. You search about insulin resistance, you read a paper, and you find out in that paper, you come across a word you don't know. Like, for example, you don't know the AMP kinase pathway, which is very involved in inhibiting insulin resistance. So, for example, you want to know more about that, but in the context of insulin resistance. What you would do then is open another scholar.google.com tab and search AMP kinase or AMPK and insulin resistance. Or you may find out insulin resistance is also called metabolic syndrome. So you'll try metabolic syndrome with AMPK. And you can keep trying different words just like you would on Google. On the left-hand side of your screen, under the term articles, you'll find that you can search either through recency or relevance. I would always search under relevance unless you're looking for papers that are literally published within the last few weeks. Otherwise, you don't want to look at recency because you'll find out if you try. It won't show a very comprehensive picture. You want to search by relevance, but then you can then limit the time frame, and this is very powerful. So for example, you can search for 2005 onwards. If you're looking for current papers, 2010 onwards, 2015 onwards, not 2017 onwards, honestly, because the last 2 to 3 years has been so filled with COVID research, not 3 years, but the last couple of years has been so filled with COVID research that it distorts the search parameters. So I like to at least begin at 2015 for right now. So how do you view a paper once you've searched? Well, you'll get a list of results with titles on them. To the right of each title will be a word. Not each title. Some titles will have to the right of them on the same line either the word PDF or HTML. Some won't have anything there. If you click the title of a and these are academic papers, by the way. They only search for academic papers generally. Sometimes you'll find results that are from web pages that Google has accidentally put in there, but they're usually papers. When you click a title of a paper, it will take you to usually it'll take you to the abstract. Sometimes it'll take you to the full paper. If you reach an abstract and you want to see the full paper, remember the abstract, well, I haven't discussed it yet, but the abstract is a summary in the beginning of a paper. So if you reach an abstract, it's just a paragraph, you don't see the full paper, go back and then look at the right of the title, see if there is a link to an HTML or PDF. If there is, click that and you'll view the full paper. If there isn't a link there, I'll tell you what to do in a second. Before we leave the search results, under each title, you're going to see a few icons. I want to tell you a little bit about them. First of all, the star icon saves the paper to your general folder in your library. Now, you should go into your library once you start researching and develop folders so you can easily sift through the papers that you've saved. This can really, really change your life. It's so valuable. Second, to the right of the star, you'll see a quotation mark. If you click the quotation mark under the paper title, you'll get the paper's citation in several citation styles. This used to take us so much time to do in undergrad. We had to figure out how to cite each style, and sometimes a different professor would want a different style. This saves so much time, it's unbelievable. So when you want to cite a paper, all you got to do is go to that quotation mark. I prefer the APA style, but you can choose your style and copy and paste that into your, for example, Word document and put it in either as a footnote or as a citation. To the right of the quotation mark, you'll see the word cited by. Cited by is extremely valuable. So what does cited by show you? Remember, these academic papers over time create a chain of logic and accountability as they cite each other's papers to build up their reasoning over time. When you check the cited by function on Google Scholar, you can quickly see which papers developed their reasoning based on the paper you're reading. And this can show you also the influence of that paper. Extremely valuable in the process of your research. When you find a paper that interests you, always open a new tab with the cited by and see where that paper went, who relied on it. You'll find very interesting papers there too. Finally, the all X version. There'll be like all 5 versions, all 3 versions, whatever of the paper. Why would you ever click that one? So this is what I wanted to tell you. If you ended up opening a paper's title and finding that it was just the abstract, then going back and finding there was no PDF or HTML link on the right of the paper's title. So you think you can't access the paper. You still can. What you need to find is what's called a DOI, I think they call it a DOI number, but it's like sort of like a DOI hyperlink. You'll find this DOI hyperlink on one of the abstracts. The problem is the abstract that you first clicked may not be the one that has it. Sometimes they don't always write it. So all you got to do if that happens is click the all 4 versions, 5 versions, whatever. It'll take you to a new tab, which will show you the publication of that abstract in various websites. At least one of them will have the DOI number. And that will begin with HTTP and have doi.org and backslash, I think they call it, followed by a number. If you copy and paste that into sci-hub.se, you'll see the full paper. If you don't see the full paper there, if when you paste that link in, it opens a new page that's blank, it means the paper is extremely recent and is not yet there. This happens very rarely, and the paper will usually show up there in a few months. Now that I've taken you through an introduction of what academic papers are, given you my opinion on Wikipedia as being a starting point, and giving you my directions on using Google Scholar, let's talk a little bit about how to learn a subject through these papers. First of all, how are academic papers organized? One of the wonderful things about academic papers is that they're organized in a consistent fashion and in a way that makes it the easiest to understand them quickest. This is why a lot of medical doctors, for example, don't know the details of papers but know the outcomes. And because you can just read an abstract very quickly to know the outcome of a paper without knowing the details. But this also means that it's much easier to read through them over time and develop a base of knowledge through academic papers, because you'll know what to look at. Whereas each different book may be formatted differently, academic papers tend to begin with an abstract. You should always read the abstract, obviously. But if you just read abstracts, you'll have you won't have deep knowledge. So like if you were spending all your time on Wikipedia, you would have breadth but not depth. So you want to read, of course, the abstract, but then you have an introduction. Then there will be usually in methods section. The methods section describes how they did their experiment or study. Then there'll be an analysis section of some kind, followed by a discussion section. Usually the discussion section and the introduction section are enough for you to learn a subject. So for example, if you want to learn a new subject, like I want to learn about metabolic syndrome, I don't want to learn a specific paper's view on it. I want to learn about it in general. I want to learn about the history of it, the study of it comprehensively. This is sort of how I approach subjects. Here, you'd want to, even in the papers that are not review papers, if you read their introduction and description, you'll start to accumulate a breadth of knowledge. On the other hand, if you want to criticize a paper, you have to deeply understand their methods section and the analysis section. And to do so, you have to have a background in study design and statistical analysis at the very least. So how would I go about learning a new subject? Say I wanted to learn about insulin resistance or metabolic syndrome, and I know absolutely nothing about it. What I would do is seek out those review papers that are less incentivized for academics. Some review papers are good, and some are excellent. Actually, some are also horrible. But you want to read a few review papers if you want to master a subject. What I like to do in the beginning is limit my search results to 2015 onwards, so it's the most recent. And then I'll search the subject and look for a paper that's descriptive and is a proper, comprehensive, exhaustive review paper. Usually won't find one. So I'll go back to 2010 onwards and I'll start to find a few, and I'll find probably one after 2015, but it won't be a great one. And I'll start to read all of those. And then I'll go backwards to 2015 or something like that. Usually in those review papers, you'll be able to find the most important papers historically also. And so you'll be able to find them directly from there and look at them in Google Scholar if you want to. But this action of reading, say, 5 to 10 review papers from, say, 2005 onwards will give you a really bird's eye comprehensive view on a subject. This is the best way to quickly learn about a subject. It's not to go on Google and search for a paper. Never use google.com. Google.com is not for anybody who researches seriously. If you research seriously, you limit yourself to scholar.google.com. You don't look on google.com. You don't read like message boards for information. You go into the actual academic journals and take yourself seriously. Whether you were trained in academia or not, you may not have the background to, like, for example, criticize the experimental design and the statistical analysis and understand these things, but you can definitely follow through with academics discussion on topics. The more papers you use, the more your vocabulary will change. Like, for example, you guys who watch Derek, you know Derek always used the word attenuate, just like I do. He used the word supraphysiological, just like I do. Why? Because Derek spends his time reading papers. It'll change the way you talk, but it'll also make it much easier for you to read papers. You'll be able to follow everything. You'll be able to follow the lines of reasoning properly. Take yourself seriously and don't limit yourself to Google. So these are my tips on researching in 2021. I hope they help some of you. I know that they're a little bit basic for other people, but I bet a lot of people will change the way they research after they hear this. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me, and I'll see you next time.